The forest was alive, but not in the way most would imagine. It was a world of whispers, rustling leaves, distant calls, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. The air was thick with humidity, clinging to the skin like a second layer. Sunlight filtered through the dense canopy above, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. Somewhere in this labyrinth of green, a golden orb-weaver spider waited, its web glistening with morning dew. The spider was a master of its craft, its web a delicate yet formidable trap. Stretched between two sturdy branches, the web shimmered like a jewel in the dim light. The spider sat motionless at the edge, its golden body blending seamlessly with the environment. It was patient, as all predators must be. The forest was its domain, and the web was its throne. Nearby, a human observer crouched low, hidden behind a cluster of ferns. Dr. Elena Marquez, a biologist, had been tracking the spider for weeks. She had come to this remote sanctuary to study the intricate behaviors of the golden orb weaver, but something about this particular spider had captivated her. Its web was larger, more intricate than any she had seen before. It seemed almost purposeful. Elena's breath was shallow, her heart pounding in her chest. She had learned to move silently, to blend into the forest as though she were part of it. But today the forest felt different. The usual symphony of sounds, chirping birds, buzzing insects, had faded into an eerie silence. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Her eyes darted to the web. The spider had shifted, its legs twitching as if sensing something. Elena's stomach tightened. She had seen this behavior before, but never with such intensity. The spider was alert, its body poised for action. A faint rustle broke the silence. Elena's head snapped toward the sound. Her pulse quickened as she scanned the undergrowth. At first she saw nothing. Then a shadow moved. A sleek, muscular form slipping between the trees. A jaguar. The big cat moved with a grace that was both beautiful and terrifying. Its golden eyes glowed like embers, scanning the forest with predatory precision. Elena froze, her body rigid. She had encountered jaguars before, but never this close. The jaguar paused, its gaze locking onto her hiding spot. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, the spider moved. It was subtle at first, a slight vibration in the web, but the jaguar noticed. Its ears twitched and its head turned toward the source of the disturbance. The spider's legs danced across the silk, sending ripples through the intricate structure. The jaguar's curiosity was piqued. It took a step closer, its movements slow and deliberate. Elena's mind raced. She had read about the golden orb weaver's ability to manipulate its web, to create vibrations that mimicked the movements of prey. But this was different. The spider wasn't trying to lure the jaguar, it was warning it. The jaguar growled, a low, rumbling sound that sent shivers down Elena's spine. It took another step, its eyes narrowing as it focused on the web. The spider responded with a series of rapid vibrations, the web trembling as though alive. The jaguar hesitated, its instincts warring with its curiosity. Elena's breath caught in her throat. She had never seen anything like this. The spider was defending its territory, using its web as both a weapon and a shield. The jaguar, a creature at the top of the food chain, was being challenged by something no larger than a coin. The tension was palpable. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable clash. But then, something unexpected happened. The jaguar backed away. It was a slow, deliberate retreat, its eyes never leaving the web. The spider remained motionless, its golden body gleaming in the filtered light. The jaguar turned and disappeared into the shadows, its growl fading into the distance. Elena exhaled, her body trembling with relief. She looked at the spider, a newfound respect swelling within her. This tiny creature had faced one of the Amazon's most fearsome predators, and won. But as she stood to leave, a strange sensation washed over her. The forest, once silent, was now alive with sound. Birds chirped, insects buzzed, and the wind whispered through the trees. It was as though the forest had been holding its breath, waiting for the outcome of the encounter. Elena glanced back at the web. The spider was gone, its golden body vanished into the foliage. She felt a chill, a sense of unease that she couldn't quite shake. The forest was watching her, its ancient eyes following her every move. As she made her way back to camp, the image of the spider lingered in her mind. It was more than just a predator, it was a guardian, a symbol of the delicate balance that held the Amazon together. And in that moment, Elena realized that she was not the observer, she was the intruder. The forest had allowed her to witness its secrets, but it would not forgive her presence lightly. As the shadows deepened and the sounds of the forest grew louder, Elena quickened her pace. She could feel the weight of the forest's gaze, a silent reminder that she was merely a guest in its domain. And somewhere, hidden in the dense foliage, the golden orb weaver watched, its web glistening like a beacon in the fading light. This story builds suspense through detailed descriptions of the environment, the behavior of the animals, and the escalating tension between the spider, the jaguar, and the human observer. The twist, the spider's ability to deter the jaguar, adds an element of surprise, while the ending leaves a lingering sense of mystery and unease. Elena's footsteps quickened as she navigated the labyrinth of trees, her boots crunching softly against the forest floor. The camp was only a mile away, but the dense undergrowth made the journey feel endless. The air grew heavier, the humidity clinging to her skin like a second layer. She could still feel the forest's gaze on her, as though the trees themselves were alive and watching. The sounds of the forest had returned, but they were different now, more urgent, more chaotic. Birds called out in sharp warning cries, and the rustling of leaves seemed to follow her like a shadow. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see the jaguar stalking her. But there was nothing, only the endless green and the faint glimmer of sunlight breaking through the canopy. Her mind raced as she walked. The spider's behavior had been unlike anything she had ever documented. Golden orb weavers were known for their intricate webs and patient hunting strategies, but this one had displayed a level of intelligence and awareness that defied explanation. It had manipulated its web not to catch prey, but to communicate, to warn, to challenge. And the jaguar, a creature of instinct and power, had heeded that warning. Elena's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, sharp sound, a crack, like a branch snapping underfoot. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The forest seemed to hold its breath again, the usual cacophony of life falling silent. She scanned the area, her eyes darting between the trees. Nothing moved. But then she saw it. A few yards ahead, suspended between two low-hanging branches, was another web. It was larger than the first, its silk strands glistening with moisture, and at its center sat a golden orb weaver, its body gleaming like molten gold. Elena's breath caught in her throat. This couldn't be the same spider. It was too far from the original web, and yet there was something eerily familiar about it. The way it sat motionless, its legs poised as if waiting, the way its web seemed to hum with an almost imperceptible vibration. She took a cautious step forward, her training overriding her fear. This was an opportunity, a chance to observe the spider up close, to document its behavior. But as she approached, the spider moved. Its legs danced across the web, sending ripples through the silk. The vibrations grew stronger, more deliberate, until the entire web seemed to tremble. Elena stopped, her instincts screaming at her to retreat. The spider's movements were too calculated, too purposeful. It wasn't just defending its territory, it was communicating. But with whom? The answer came in the form of a low, guttural growl. Elena's blood ran cold. She turned slowly, her eyes widening as she saw the jaguar emerge from the shadows. It was the same one from before, its golden eyes locked on her with an intensity that made her stomach churn. The big cat's muscles rippled beneath its spotted coat, its tail flicking in agitation. She was trapped. The spider's web was behind her, the jaguar in front. The forest seemed to close in around her, the trees pressing closer, the air growing thicker. She could feel the weight of the jaguar's gaze, its predatory instincts honed in on her. But then something extraordinary happened. The spider's web began to vibrate again, the ripples growing stronger, more insistent. The jaguar's ears twitched, its attention shifting from Elena to the web. For a moment, the big cat hesitated, its eyes narrowing as it studied the shimmering structure. Elena didn't wait. She moved, slowly, carefully, stepping to the side and putting distance between herself and the jaguar. The spider continued its dance, the web trembling with an almost musical rhythm. The jaguar growled, a deep, rumbling sound that echoed through the forest, but it didn't attack. Instead, it turned and disappeared into the undergrowth, its movements swift and silent. Elena let out a shaky breath, her legs trembling beneath her. She looked at the spider, its golden body gleaming in the dim light. It had saved her, not once but twice. And yet, there was no sense of triumph in its stillness, no hint of victory. It simply sat, its legs poised as if waiting for the next threat. As she made her way back to camp, the forest seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The sounds of life returned, birds chirping, insects buzzing, leaves rustling in the breeze. But Elena couldn't shake the feeling that she had witnessed something extraordinary, something that defied explanation. The golden orb weaver wasn't just a predator. It was a guardian, a keeper of balance in a world where life and death were constant companions. And as Elena sat in her tent that night, her notes spread out before her, she couldn't help but wonder if the forest had allowed her to see its secrets, or if it had simply used her as a pawn in its ancient, unending game. Somewhere in the darkness, the spider waited, its web glistening like a beacon in the night. And the forest watched, its ancient eyes gleaming with a wisdom that no human could ever fully understand. This continuation deepens the mystery and suspense, emphasizing the spider's role as a guardian and the forest's sentient, almost mystical presence. The story leaves the audience with a sense of awe and unease, questioning the true nature of the Amazon and its inhabitants. Elena spent the next few days in a state of heightened awareness. Every rustle of leaves, every distant call seemed to carry a weight it hadn't before. The forest felt alive in a way that was both exhilarating and unnerving. She continued her research, documenting the behaviors of the golden orb weavers, but her focus had shifted. She wasn't just studying the spiders anymore. She was trying to understand their place in the larger tapestry of the Amazon. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest was bathed in twilight, Elena decided to revisit the site of the second web. She packed her equipment carefully, a camera, a notebook, and a small flashlight. The air was cooler now, the humidity less oppressive, but the forest still felt charged with an almost electric energy. As she approached the area, she noticed something unusual. The web was gone. Elena's heart skipped a beat as she stared at the empty space between the branches. The web, which had been so meticulously crafted and so full of life just days ago, had vanished without a trace. She scanned the area, her flashlight cutting through the deepening shadows. There was no sign of the spider, no remnants of silk clinging to the bark. It was as though the web had never existed. Her mind raced. Golden orb weavers didn't abandon their webs without reason. They were territorial creatures, often rebuilding in the same location if their webs were damaged. This disappearance made no sense. She crouched low, examining the ground beneath the branches. The forest floor was littered with fallen leaves and twigs, but something caught her eye. A faint indentation in the soil, as though something heavy had passed through. Her pulse quickened as she followed the trail, her flashlight beam trembling slightly in her hand. The trail led her deeper into the forest, away from the familiar paths she had marked during her research. The trees grew denser, their gnarled roots twisting like serpents across the ground. The air grew cooler, the sounds of the forest fading into an eerie silence. Elena's instincts screamed at her to turn back, but her curiosity pushed her forward. After what felt like an eternity, she emerged into a small clearing. The sight that greeted her made her breath catch in her throat. In the center of the clearing stood a massive tree, its trunk wider than any she had ever seen. Its roots sprawled out like the tentacles of some ancient beast, and its branches reached high into the canopy, disappearing into the darkness above. But it wasn't the tree itself that held her attention. It was what hung from its branches. Dozens of golden orb weaver webs stretched between the branches, their silk glistening in the beam of her flashlight. Each web was perfectly intact, their intricate patterns shimmering like works of art, and at the center of each web sat a golden orb weaver, their bodies gleaming like molten gold. Elena's hands trembled as she raised her camera, snapping photos of the surreal scene. The spiders were motionless, their legs poised as if waiting. The clearing was utterly silent, the air thick with an almost palpable tension. As she stepped closer, she noticed something else. The ground beneath the tree was littered with bones. Small animals, birds, and even the remains of larger creatures. The sight sent a chill down her spine. This wasn't just a gathering of spiders. It was a graveyard. Her flashlight flickered, the beam growing dim. She shook it, but the light continued to fade. Panic surged through her as the darkness closed in. She turned to leave, but the path she had followed was gone, swallowed by the shadows. The silence was broken by a faint, rhythmic sound, a soft tapping, like the patter of rain on leaves. She turned back to the tree, her flashlight beam flickering one last time before going out completely. In the darkness, she could just make out the shapes of the spiders, their legs moving in unison, tapping against their webs. The sound grew louder, more insistent. It was no longer just tapping. It was a vibration, a hum that seemed to resonate through the very ground beneath her feet. The air grew heavier, pressing against her skin like a living thing. Elena's breath came in short, shallow gasps. She stumbled backward, her foot catching on a root. She fell hard, the impact knocking the wind from her lungs. As she struggled to rise, she felt something brush against her arm, a strand of silk, sticky and cold. Her heart pounded as she looked up. The spiders were descending, their golden bodies gliding down on threads of silk. They moved in perfect synchrony, their legs tapping out a rhythm that seemed to echo in her mind. She scrambled to her feet, her instincts screaming at her to run. But the clearing was a maze of roots and shadows, and the path was gone. The spiders closed in, their webs shimmering like a net closing around her. In that moment, Elena understood. The golden orb weavers weren't just predators or guardians. They were something more. They were the keepers of this place, the enforcers of a balance that had existed long before humans set foot in the Amazon, and she had trespassed into their domain. The last thing she saw before the darkness swallowed her was the gleam of golden silk wrapping around her like a cocoon. The next morning, the forest was alive with sound once more. Birds chirped, insects buzzed, and the wind whispered through the trees. The clearing was empty, the massive tree standing silent and still. There was no sign of Elena, no trace of her equipment. But if one were to look closely, they might notice a faint glimmer of golden silk among the roots, catching the light like a fleeting memory. And somewhere, deep within the forest, the golden orb weavers waited, their webs glistening like beacons in the shadows. The Amazon had reclaimed its own. This conclusion amplifies the suspense and mystery, leaving the audience with a haunting sense of the forest's power and the enigmatic role of the golden orb weavers. The story ends on a chilling note, emphasizing the idea that some secrets are best left undiscovered.